But it's crazy that when you think of Trump's second term, you know, despite some of his hardcore fans hoping for a third term, technically the Constitution prevents that, forbids that, so not going to happen. He really does not care anymore about some of the things that he had to concern himself with in his first term. I think in his first term, what happened is the first 6 months, first year, he still had a lot of like career politicians, people who may not have been loyal to him, but who represented like guardrails and safeguards for him to kind of conduct himself a certain way. And you could argue that he still did whatever the hell he wanted. But in his second term now, I think you're seeing someone that kind of has mastered the DC politics game and still refuses to play by it. That's the more interesting thing as a case study. But, you know, if you look at what happened on the day when Chinese diplomats were in Venezuela, you know, and Venezuela, kind of like Cuba, is under the, obviously as a communist country, they're under like the China and Russian sphere of influence. So if you think about it, on the very same day that Chinese diplomats were in Venezuela, obviously to talk about oil, to talk about weapons, to talk about whatever, the US sends in, you know, their army, and basically Maduro says kidnapped, America says arrest. We'll leave that to the courts.
Sure.
And they pluck him and his wife. And Maduro was actually sitting there a few days before bragging about how the defense systems that the Islamic Republic of Iran gave Venezuela were going to prevent such a scenario. So you can't really script this. And I mean, I, as somebody who was born in Iran, who lives in the West, and sometimes sees, you know, these folks who live in the West, they love the liberties, they love the freedoms that are bestowed upon them here. And they basically are fanboys because of like their criticism of American foreign policy, which I think that's fair if you want to criticize foreign policy. But then while you would never get up and go live in the Islamic Republic of Iran under the mullahs, you fanboy for them. And that to me is shocking. It's I mean, to me, it's unacceptable. People can do what they want. And so when you saw these, to quote, you know, these leftist, liberal, lunatic losers, as Trump would call them, who are hitting the streets and saying, you know, this is horrible. What has America done? Maduro's this, Maduro's that. I'm like, well, look at the Venezuelans who are singing and chanting, and they're happy. And I do think, according to the census, I am a white person. So if you and I are two gringos sitting here talking about this, I know Ivan, our producer, Ivan, you should probably join us. It would be
let's get him into
jumping in here. Don't be fooled by the Captain America shield and the metallic shirt. I am very much Colombian, living in Mexico. So
what are your thoughts on Maduro?
I think the conversation that I've had ever since this happened is that Maduro wasn't the issue. He needed to go out at one point or another because he was a terrible person, a terrible dictator, and the country is hopefully going to be better off without him. However, what angers, I think, a lot of people, and what the conversation kind of shut down, the moment the conversation kind of shuts down, is when you start saying, yeah, but the US has no plan. So this was all about the oil. And I've seen a lot of posts from the right and saying, yeah, oh, but you only focus on the oil, you don't care about Venezuelans and stuff like that. Of course you do. Of course, you know, of course you can say that I can care about both issues. And to be honest, the track record of the U.S. in Latin America is not great. It's, you know, Honduras, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, everywhere, right? So
in the Middle East, they went into Iraq saying we're going to be liberators and greeted with roses. Nothing
happened. Exactly. And the fact that right now it's so blatantly obvious that they have absolutely no plans for Venezuela, and even the oil companies are like, no, we're hands off. We're not even, you know, we don't even want to play in that playground. I think that's what angers a lot of the people. So yeah, I think that the conversation, because I saw your tweet about, you know, people dancing in the streets and stuff like that, but you look at the footage from Venezuela and they're shooting in the streets and they're hunting people down from one place or the other, from one thought or the other. So if you were against Maduro, they're going to hunt you down. The opposition party is nowhere to be found. Corina Machado, who was the Nobel Prize winner, went on television and said, "I'll like Trump, I'll give you the Nobel Prize, dude. Come on. I mean, we need you to do what you say you're going to do." It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And these things are going to keep happening. So, and you do get worried because he mentioned the two countries I care for the most, Colombia and Mexico. So I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place here with that.
Don't worry.
No, I agree.
Before the army does a 180 and gets to Colombia or Mexico, he's like lining up to probably attack around. So there is a parallel, and that's why I wanted to talk about these things. Very similar, like I honeymooned in Cuba. I love Cuban people. Like, I love all Latin. They're such warm people. I'm not saying this because Ivan is here. But I mean, nobody is leaving Miami on a raft and trying to get to Havana. It's like when the Berlin Wall fell, the people from the East ran to the West, not the other way around. So I actually like people who are intellectually honest that could say, yeah, you know what? Not a fan of Maduro, but obviously maybe the way the US went about it. Now, but the problem is, really sad to see that 30 Cuban soldiers effectively died in that operation. But to quote one of the Venezuelans who was interviewed, he's like, why were there Cubans then? If you care so much, it's a foreign force that is on Venezuelan soil. And then Cubans, at least you could argue, are close to us. There's a big body of water separating them, but it's kind of like fellow Latinos, you could argue. Do you think Russia and China were in Venezuela for the arepas recipe, as the Venezuelans said? And I actually think we always oversimplify it. Whereas Iraq was 100% oil. No, let's actually break it down. Iraq was 90% oil, 80% oil, but it was also a vendetta because George Bush W's father was apparently on like the hit list of Saddam Hussein. So W wants to make his dad, Papa, happy and finish what Papa Bush didn't complete. So there's always these extra things. So for me, Venezuela is, again, 80% oil. Venezuela has more oil than any other country, but they don't develop it because of incompetence and corruption. So I'm at a point where I'm like, yes. The proceeds should go to the Venezuelan people. Full stop. But if the Venezuelan regime, and Maduro did not win the last election, right? Like he lost the election and he kind of used force to stay in power. So I'm like, at some point, if that government is using force and they're corrupt and they're incompetent, I don't think we should have this sense of indignation if American ingenuity and American corporations with their expertise go. I'm not condoning the following, but it's fascinating how when Donald Trump tells Chevron, and Chevron is apparently the only company that stayed in Venezuela because of a sanctions waiver, but he basically is using state capitalism by telling Chevron, Exxon, all these companies, they're like, if you want to get back the assets that Chavez and Maduro basically confiscated from you, like assets that legally were yours, but they just nationalized them, he's like, you have to go and invest the billions to get the Venezuelan oil infrastructure back, which again, I'm like, you know what? It's actually not a bad approach. Like that's at least an economic plan. You could disagree with it, but yes, Trump likes theatrics. He's more of a Hollywood guy. So they don't really have a plan. And I'm similarly worried, like I'm secular, I'm not religious at all, but even in Iran, when I hear those opposed to the regime, when I hear the only good mullah, like religious person, is a dead one, again, I'm not religious. Personally, I don't care about religion. But I'm like, I don't like when I hear, one group killing fellow compatriots just because they disagree. So I'm also hoping that whatever happens in Iran does not spill over into retribution and retaliation, because then, an eye for an eye and everybody's blind. So fascinating.
I think the commercial discourse that's what's most worrying, like the commercial and corporate discourse and the way it's being talked about. I think that's one of the biggest worries, because there's no and I'm gonna sound really, really, really far left, but there's no humane way of talking about these things, you know. There's no. Oh yeah, no, the infrastructure for Venezuela, and we're gonna, you know, get back the roads and get back the you know, all this part. It's not that. It's we're gonna give you the oil. You're gonna do whatever you want with it, and there's absolutely no mention of anything else. And that's something that corporations have done in Latin America for a while. Nestle in Brazil, in Mexico, you know, all these corporations that, and even Canadian mining companies here in Mexico. It was a big debate here because they're strip mining the hell out of the landscape in Mexico, and you know, it's business and it's, you know, it's innovation and stuff like that, but it's not, you know, it's not sustainable and it's not there. So I think it's that, and the fact that it can be replicated, and the ideas that he used to kind of excuse the actions can be replicated somewhere else, like Greenland or Mexico or Colombia. I think it, you know, it should worry a lot of people. And one thing I did tell my friends, I have a couple of friends that live in the States. They're like, you guys should be super pissed that you guys can't afford healthcare, and here's this guy running Venezuela, you know. So I think that's kind of like where it should go. Like, you should be super angry that this is happening because he doesn't care. He literally doesn't care, like you said. But yeah, I think that's the general discourse of, about that, and kind of look at it from both sides, that Maduro did have to
But
go
can I
out.
play devil's advocate? Can I play
Yeah,
devil's advocate?
go for it. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So why is it then? First of all, I actually, this is contrarian, not devil's advocate. This is actually how I feel. I rather if politicians were candid. Like, I rather Trump come out and say it's all about the oil. It's our oil. You know, Americans had rights and we're going to get them back, which to me, I'm like, well, it was originally not your oil, but okay, let's set that aside. I rather that than like bullshitting people both in the US and like at the time in Iraq and elsewhere to talk about freedoms and all that, when it is more economic incentive, you know. So I personally don't mind it if politicians at least are candid with their no matter how, you know, distasteful. I think it's better because then the electorate can make decisions when they vote and not think it's about
Exactly.
religious.
I mean, I think that's, go for it. Yeah, go.
No, but the devil's advocate part is like, if you are concerned about Americans not having like health or infrastructure crumbling, but you go and say, well, what's happening in Minnesota with the Somali fraudsters and the daycares, you are branded a racist. When I'm like, yeah, I don't care if they're from Somalia or from Green or from Sweden. It's just wrong, right? Like, if at face value, prima facie, that is happening, where they're saying we have 1,000 students to get a credit per child, but really there's no kids. Let's just like simplify it. That should outrage Americans. But if you raise your hand, you're branded racisto. Whereas I'm like, yeah, bullshit. It's not racist. It's these people are criminals, regardless of where they're from. And so that seems to be problematic.